Forget Heisenberg the mastermind for a second. Here's a question that should feel illegal to ask. Was Walter White actually helping the DEA? Because once the Better Call Saul context snaps into place, the legend starts to look embarrassingly small. Gus Fring wasn't running a street hustle. He was running a machine. Corporate supply lines, professional distribution, disciplined laundering, and enough insulation that the DEA couldn't even smell it. Everyone got paid, nobody panicked, and the whole operation could have kept printing money for years. Then Walter shows up with world-class chemistry and amateur hour everything else. Money laundering? A car wash. Cash management? A storage unit stuffed like a doomsday bunker. Partnerships? A trail of betrayals and corpses. He didn't outsmart an empire. He dragged it into the light with ego, noise, and chaos. So when Mike says, "We had a good thing," that isn't nostalgia. That's an autopsy. And by the end of this video, the question won't be whether Walt was brilliant. He was. The question is whether his empire was actually the DEA's most effective weapon, wearing a pork pie hat. Better Call Saul performs an unintentional public service. It retroactively exposes just how amateurish Walter White's grand criminal empire really was. Yes, Walter White is a legitimate genius in chemistry. That much is never in doubt. The problem is that genius in chemistry does not automatically translate into competence in logistics, money laundering, personnel management, operational security, or, most fatally, basic emotional self-regulation. Watching the machinery behind Gus Fring, Madrigal, and Lydia Rodarte Quayle makes it impossible to ignore the scale and sophistication of the world Walter wandered into like a man who has mistaken a hurricane warning for a networking event. Before Walter ever put on a pork pie hat, the operation was already running at a level he could barely conceptualize. Gus and Lydia were embedded in a multinational corporate ecosystem with distribution channels, supply chains, compartmentalization, disciplined cash flow, and the kind of institutional camouflage that allows an empire to exist in plain sight. Executives lived in immaculate homes. Payroll was consistent. Everyone understood their role. The DEA, for all its swagger and press conferences, didn't have a clue. Meanwhile, Walter's crown jewel of laundering innovation was a car wash, an honest, conspicuous retail business with customers, staff, receipts, and cameras purchased specifically because it sounded respectable. Even then, the laundering aspect was so clumsy it required constant improvisation, and the cash still ended up stacked like a doomsday craft project in a storage unit. In the end, much of it slid into the hands of neo-Nazis, because nothing says business acumen like outsourcing your financial future to people whose resume is mostly hate crimes and bad decisions. The contrast becomes almost comedic when placed against the Salamanca cash reserves, stashed not as a sweaty pile of panic, but in a private vault hidden under a garage full of classic cars. That was not the top of the food chain. It was merely one of the more flamboyant limbs. The cartel world depicted around Gus had redundancy, patience, and restraint. Traits that matter far more than raw intellect when the stakes include prison or a bullet. In that context, Walter looks less like a criminal mastermind and more like a lit match thrown into a server room. Bright, dramatic, and catastrophically stupid. That is why it becomes tempting, almost irresistible, to argue that Walter White was, in a perverse way, the DEA's best friend. Not because he cooperated, and certainly not because he had any civic virtue left to activate, but because his presence was an accelerant. Had Walter never entered the meth trade, the existing empire could have continued humming along, profitable, insulated, and quiet enough to outlast bureaucratic attention spans. Walter didn't just disrupt the game, he vandalized it. The damage he caused to lives, families, and institutions was enormous. But from a narrow law enforcement perspective, he did what the DEA failed to do. He forced a sophisticated criminal network into the open by turning it into a reckless spectacle. At this point, the familiar explanation presents itself: hubris and ego. Breaking Bad makes that case explicitly, and the expanded universe only sharpens it. Walter did not fail because he lacked intelligence. Walter failed because he could not tolerate being anything less than the sun in his own solar system. He couldn't accept the humiliating reality of being an essential gear in someone else's exceptionally lucrative machine. A man offered the chance to be paid lavishly, protected professionally, and insulated structurally, responded as though he'd been asked to fetch coffee. The tragedy is not that Walter was unappreciated. The tragedy is that he needed appreciation, the way other people need oxygen, and he was willing to poison everyone around him to get a full breath. The clearest articulation of this arrives through Mike Ehrmantraut's famous condemnation. The reminder that there was a functioning system, Fring, the lab, the structure, and Walter wrecked it. With the Better Call Saul context, that speech hits harder, because it is not merely moral judgment, it's operational grief. Walter was a violent storm that tore through an ecosystem designed to survive decades. He did not build, he toppled. He did not scale, he scorched. And yet, the most honest critique has to admit that Mike's version, while emotionally satisfying, is not perfectly complete. Walter did not turn on Gus purely out of ego in the earliest stages. He worked under Gus until the conflict became existential. The breaking point was Jesse. Walter defended Jesse, and that single act, part loyalty, part paternalism, part self-protection, placed him in Gus's crosshairs. Once Gus decided Walter was a liability, survival instincts took over. The conflict escalated because Gus escalated it. Gus recruited Walter aggressively because he wanted the product, then chose to align himself with operators willing to murder children, drawing a clear line that Jesse would not tolerate and Walter would not ignore. The situation combusted through accumulation. Gus's insistence on control, Walter's insistence on autonomy, Jesse's volatility, and a business model that treats human life as an expendable supply. Blaming it entirely on Walter's ego is clean and convenient. Reality, like the show, is messier. That nuance matters for another reason. The comforting temptation to cast Gus and Mike as better simply because they are calmer. Professionalism is not morality. Composure is not decency. Gus and Mike are extraordinary characters, precise, disciplined, and strategically patient. But their restraint does not absolve them. Their empire depends on addiction, corruption, violence, and the quiet normalization of atrocity. The difference is mostly aesthetic. Walter is loud in his destruction. They are quiet in theirs. The only figures on the drug empire side who reliably earn sympathy are the ones crushed by the machinery rather than steering it. Jesse Pinkman, and by the wider universe's logic, Nacho Varga. Everyone else is choosing a lane in hell and arguing over who merged more elegantly. This is where the character study becomes damning. Walter White is brilliant, but he is not wise. Not even slightly. Many of the people around him are cold and calculating professionals who understand the most important rule of illicit power. Do not call attention to yourself. Walter, by contrast, is not playing chess. He is staging a theatrical production in which the universe finally recognizes his greatness. He wants to stop feeling like a nobody who spent his life being overlooked, only to be handed terminal cancer as a final insult. That anger might be human, but the way he feeds it is pure narcissism. He burns everyone down, chasing the feeling of being substantial, including the family he claims to be protecting. It is riveting television precisely because it is a slow-motion car crash with periodic speeches. The comparison with Jimmy McGill only underlines Walter's fatal flaw. Jimmy begins rash, brash, and hungry. Slippin' Jimmy with a taste for shortcuts and a need to prove he isn't perpetually second-rate next to his brother. But Jimmy learns. Slowly, painfully. He learns that the long, quiet game wins. He learns how to read a room, how to build leverage, how to survive systems by understanding them. Walter never learns that lesson. Walter tries to dominate systems through force of ego, and when that fails, he doubles down. If Jimmy is an improviser who eventually becomes methodical, Walter is a methodical mind that becomes increasingly impulsive. Their collisions with larger forces produce different outcomes. Jimmy is absorbed, reshaped, and ultimately ruined by the machinery. Walter is a wrecking ball that insists it is an architect. Even Walter's backstory quietly hints that the problem is not a lack of opportunity, but a pattern of self-sabotage. There is evidence of at least one respectable job between leaving gray matter and teaching high school chemistry. He had chances. He had on-ramps. He had exits. What he lacked was the emotional maturity to tolerate any situation in which he was not the undisputed genius in the room. A plausible reading is that his career decline was driven by ego, issues with authority, friction with peers, an inability to collaborate with equals, and the slow drift toward the one environment where he could always be the smartest person present. A high school classroom is not merely employment. It is a kingdom where no one can compete for grants, budgets, prestige, or intellectual dominance unless invited. There, he can be a Nobel-adjacent legend in his own mind, controlling the pace and the narrative. That need for narrative control is the same disease that infects his criminal life. Under Gus, Walter is offered the closest thing to a stable corporate structure: safer operations, a state-of-the-art lab, distribution handled by professionals, risk reduced, money steady. In theory, it is the rational choice. In practice, rationality is not the governing principle of Walter White. Walter does not want a job, even if it pays. Walter wants a throne, even if it kills him. This is why the gray matter wound matters so much. Walter's core motivation is not simply money. It is recognition. It is the resentment of watching Gretchen and Elliot become wealthy and respected, while he convinces himself he was cheated out of what was rightfully his. That wound predates cancer, marriage, and fatherhood. It is older and deeper. The belief that he is a genius the world failed to worship. He checks stock prices obsessively. He frames his criminal ambitions not as survival, but as legacy. When pressed, he admits he is not in the meth business or the money business. He is in the empire business. Empire is not a financial category. It is a psychological compensation plan. The most revealing part is not that he refuses charity. Many people refuse charity. The revelation is that he refuses solutions that preserve dignity, because he defines dignity as supremacy. When Gretchen and Elliot offer support, effectively a blank check via employment and medical coverage, his pride interprets it as pity, and pity is intolerable. There exists a universe where he swallows his ego, takes a prestigious lab role, earns money legitimately, and lives longer with his family. But that universe requires Walter to accept being helped by people he resents, and that is the one thing he will not do. He would rather cook meth and gamble his family's survival than accept a lifeline that makes him feel small. This is where the "was he always bad" debate becomes more interesting than the lazy extremes. The pilot does not present him as a monster. He is portrayed as a mild, burdened man, liked by those around him, loving toward his wife and son, working hard, trying to keep the lights on. The claim that he was always evil can sound like a refusal to engage with complexity. Yet it is equally naive to argue that he was purely good until crime transformed him. A more honest reading lands in the uncomfortable middle. He was not a monster at the start, but the seed was always there. The ego was always there. The resentment was always there. The entitlement was always there. Crime does not invent those traits. It gives them permission. It provides a stage large enough for his worst impulses to perform. And because audiences often fear humanizing evil, there is a tendency to demand that villains be simple, bad from birth, rotten from day one. It is a comforting lie. The unsettling truth is that people can be decent in daily life while carrying corrosive traits that, under pressure, metastasize into devastation. That is what makes Walter compelling and horrifying. He is not an alien. he is a familiar type. The underappreciated genius in his own head, allergic to humility, furious that life did not grant him his imagined due. This also reframes the often asked question of why he did not simply get a better job. A chemist of his caliber could have pursued industry roles, university teaching, research positions. The existence of prior high-level work suggests he was not unemployable. So why the high school? One explanation is psychological. It is the one arena where he never has to compete with peers at his level, and never has to risk being ordinary. In industry, brilliant people compete and collaborate. Grants must be won, teams must be managed, egos must be negotiated. In a high school classroom, he can be king by default. Another explanation is temperamental. Exceptionally gifted people can struggle with social dynamics, authority, and cooperation, sometimes cycling through roles until they land in the one environment that won't eject them for being difficult. Great intellect does not guarantee functional interpersonal skills. History offers plenty of geniuses who were socially unmanageable and materially unlucky. Whatever the precise mix, the pattern fits Walter, a man so hungry to be recognized that he cannot sustain situations that require him to share the spotlight. His criminal professionalism then becomes one of the show's sharpest ironies. He approaches meth cooking like a salaried job with workplace standards, complaining about surveillance cameras as a violation of the workspace, offering polite farewells to colleagues fleeing federal attention, packing lunches labeled with his name as though there might be a mix-up in the break room at a respectable lab. He dresses neatly, behaves like an industrial chemist, and clings to protocol as a way to pretend he is not doing what he is doing. It is not merely humor. It is delusion. He is cosplaying legitimacy. He missed out on being a gray matter executive, so now he imagines himself running a business so large it could be listed on the NASDAQ. Never mind that the product is misery and the balance sheet is blood. The business angle also tempts a certain grim admiration. Organized crime becomes powerful when it treats crime as business. Structure builds resilience in an uncertain environment. Professionalism reduces risk. The most successful operators are often the ones who shed the cartoonish bravado, avoid attention, and look like ordinary citizens. That is precisely why Gus's world is so formidable. It is also precisely why Walter is so destabilizing. He craves attention. He wants credit. He wants to be seen. The system Gus built is designed to avoid being seen. This is not a philosophical disagreement. It is a collision of incompatible needs. There is, however, a counterpoint that deserves respect. Walter's rise is absurdly fast. In under 2 years, he goes from anonymous teacher to regionally dominant kingpin with international recognition. Gus spent decades climbing. Walter is both the research and development genius and, increasingly, the chief executive. Given time, and without the urgency of cancer, could he have matched Gus's scale? Possibly. His chemistry is superior, and his ruthlessness accelerates results. But the question is not whether he could produce. The question is whether he could sustain. Empire building is not a sprint. It is a long, quiet marathon of relationships, patience, and systems. Walter's greatest weakness is not capability. It is intolerance for partnership. He cannot build durable trust because he is always plotting, always angling, always prioritizing his own control. Even when he behaves professionally, he is undermining everyone around him. That might win battles. It loses wars. The show practically hands him multiple exit ramps, and he ignores them with consistent stubbornness. At the start, the obvious wrong turn is choosing to cook meth at all. Another is refusing the gray matter lifeline. Another is refusing to sell the methylamine for a fortune and walk away. Another is failing to manage basic operational security. Most infamously, keeping incriminating evidence where an inquisitive relative could find it. The irony is that he repeatedly proves he can stop. He quits, he returns. He quits, he returns. Each return is not necessity. It is addiction to power and identity. Even when he claims family as motivation, his own confession eventually strips that pretense away. He did it for himself. He liked it. He was good at it. The family argument is not a lie exactly. It is a cover story he tells himself until even he can no longer tolerate it. So where does he truly go wrong? Some point to the escalation toward Tuco as the beginning of the end, entering a more violent tier before he had infrastructure or protection. Others argue that if he had avoided Tuco and gone straight to Gus, the cartel pressure, the death spiral, and the collateral damage might have been reduced. But that assumes Walter could have quietly served under Gus indefinitely, a premise the character makes impossible. Sooner or later, the need to be the man would have surfaced. Sooner or later, he would have demanded more credit, more control, more recognition. The downfall is not a single moment. It is a personality trait with a timer attached. The thought experiment, what would be done differently with full knowledge, produces the same conclusion. The rational plan is obvious. Take the high-status job, accept legitimate money, avoid criminal exposure, and ensure the family is provided for without turning the household into a war zone. If crime is still insisted upon, then take the clean exit. Sell the methylamine, relocate, diversify assets quietly, launder through legitimate ventures with competent counsel, and avoid leaving evidence lying around like a confession taped to the fridge. Even within criminal logic, the common sense moves are painfully clear. Avoid unnecessary violence. Do not antagonize partners. Do not invite law enforcement attention. And do not confuse ego gratification with strategy. The most biting illustration of Walter's irrationality is the money math that keeps haunting the story. He earns an enormous sum in a short burst of desert cooking, then balks at a steady monthly salary that is smaller in raw comparison. But the comparison is childish because it ignores the cost of chaos. Broken equipment, constant near arrests, violent encounters, stolen product, dead associates, legal payoffs, physical beatings, and the sheer exhaustion of selling directly without distribution. That early windfall isn't pure profit. It is revenue earned at catastrophic risk, with massive hidden costs and no system to sustain it. A smaller, consistent payout under Gus is not an insult. It is the price of stability. It includes distribution, security, insulation, and a modern lab. It also includes the uncomfortable truth that Walter is not the whole business. He is the chemist within it. The fact that this feels like humiliation is the point. The deal is rational. Walter is not. And this is the final, brutal clarity delivered by the expanded universe. Walter White's tragedy was never that he lacked the brainpower to succeed. It was that he lacked the character to accept the only form of success that could last. He did not simply become a villain. He became a cautionary tale about what happens when brilliance is chained to grievance, when pride outranks prudence, and when a man mistakes being feared for being fulfilled. The sophisticated criminals built an empire designed to endure. Walter built a bonfire designed to be noticed. The flames were impressive, the smoke was visible from space, and in the end, the wreckage proved what was true from the beginning. Genius without wisdom is just a faster way to ruin everything. If you like stories of smart men destroying themselves in high definition, hit subscribe.